so I think we'll begin with the second panel. We have three new panelists who will introduce themselves and yeah, we'll get started. All right, so for our second panel, we'll continue to discuss the situation in Kyrgyzstan, but from the Tibetan perspective, language rights in Tibet, and then we have an academic from the US who will be speaking about the geopolitical situation in terms of Uyghurs and Islam in China, and a third speaker from the World Uyghur Congress who will sort of tie a bit of it together and sort of what's been happening in Europe in terms of our advocacy efforts, and try to push the conversation to a place where we can sort of take steps to move forward and move towards a solution. So the first speaker will be Somo Svenningsen, if that's pronounced well enough, I suppose, the chairperson of the Norwegian Tibet Committee. She'll be taking it from the Tibet perspective and speaking about linguistic rights in Tibet.
Yes, my name is Somo Svenningsen. Assalamu alaikum. Tashidelek. Hello. I feel really at home being here. All the things that have been talked about here. It just feels like just replace the Uyghur and put Tibet. It's just the same. And whatever I'm going to show you is just the other way around. Instead of Tibet, if you put Uyghur, that will be the same. But, first, we would like to start with a small clip of a Tibetan who's still in the prison at the moment. His case is coming up, and I would like to show that case. I myself am born and raised in India. I have roots from Tibet. I've been living here in Norway since 1990s. And I've been several times the Norwegian Tibet Committee's leader. So let's start with the movie, and I'll talk about it a bit later.
You guys wanted to move to watch it?
你好，请问是那个中央电视台的焦点访谈节目吗？能不能现有因为我们整个藏区的学校的话，从小学到初中、高中，它的在多门课程中只有一门课程是藏文的。日常的这个生活中，像这个批评、移动公司啊，用的都是汉语的，怎么了？是您认为是给这个藏区带来不便了，是吗？这样对我们的民族文化来讲是毁灭性的一种打击。我是准备要起诉，然后我想问一下中央电视台的相关人士能不能报道这件事情？那么这个只能给您记录下来服务反映，能否采访由老总来决定。好的，那这个情况我您反映一下吧。您贵姓？我叫扎西。关于那么多人去自焚的我现在能理解他们，因为我们真正可以去做这件事情的渠道很少。无论任何人都不想生活在一个压力和恐惧的环境里面。从间接方面的话，它是一种谋杀民族文化的方法。 需要消灭一个民族的话，首先需要消灭它的语言和那个文字。我们在那里不敢讨论这些问题，因为现在很多手机和那些都可以监控，而且我们不知道在哪些地方放了一些监控或者监听器，它可以用任何名义来随便逮捕你，而且没有办法去上诉，或者说是因为没有一个完整的法律体系，所以我们没有办法去讨论这些问题。我的藏文一开始是我哥哥教我的，然后我现在的藏文的写作能力和那个汉语的写作能力，汉语的写作能力已经超过了藏文的写作能力。然后我自己也感觉得到藏文的使用能力和认识理解能力等都在退步。牧区的生活的话，传统的话应该每家每户都会有一些一匹马或者2匹马，然后在一个特定的季节里面就进行一些比赛。政府举办这种大型的赛马节是想对外界宣传藏族人的生活方式。有很多人会看赛马会，认为藏民族的发展的方向是正确的。当地政府当然一方面在搞一些赛马会，宣传民族的发展，然后另一方面在控制藏民族文化的实际内容的使用文字语言和一些方面的问题，在各个方面的管制都比较严格。那些的话，那就是它在表面上看起来是一种建设，或者说是一种帮助，其实是目的是为了达到消灭文化、民族文化的。你要学习真正的藏文化内容的话，只能说是去在寺庙里面当和尚学习藏族的文化，在其他地方的话就基本上没有。从2009年到现在，有140多个人自焚，他们自焚不仅仅是为了自己家里的一点事情，或者说是别的事情，他们也同样，我相信他们也同样看到了民族文化的消失和这些问题，但是我们没有渠道去解决这样的问题。但是我这一次是想通过中华人民共和国的法律手段来解决这个问题。去北京的原因主要有2个，第一件事情是我想见一下中央电视台的媒体记者，看看他们能不能报道这件事情。第2件事情，我是想找中央的人民法院，我看看能不能结束这场官司，因为在中华人民共和国的法律里面明确规定是可以控告或者说是起诉任何一个官员。我直接进去看身份证，我可能就被带进去，带到公安局去，然后我需要想别的办法。但有点失望，我想象之中它应该是开放性的嘛，媒体报道是为了真实性的。那现在门被封起来了，然后他们有选择性的那种起 进入或者说是拒绝。我去了10几家律师事务所，但是他们大多数的律师没有回答相关的问题。有很多律师会说，这种政策是对我们藏族有非常大的好处和利益的方面的。我现在做这件事情，如果法庭能接受这场官司的话，最好。如果说不能接受的话，他表达了一点，那就是整个藏族的问题通过法律是无法实现的。这一点它是至少体现出来这一个问题。比如说我被控制了，如果没有办法进行这样的下去，而且他们会逼迫我去让我说一些我不想说的事情，做一些我不想做的事情，我会选择自杀。
Again, this I just wanted to show where Tibet and East Turkestan is to each other. We are neighbors. We are right beside each other. And China is less than half of us two together, if you can see it. And I have put the flag and your flag, and I hope the proportion is right, and because I don't want to offend anyone, because I know if I would have put my Tibetan map a little bit wrong, I would be really offended. And yesterday I had done that little bit wrong, and my boyfriend was pissed off with me. He said, if you are not aware of that, then what are you doing? So I had to correct it. So I hope East Turkestan is right.
Actually, my hometown is inside Tibet.
Oh!
I was born Catholic in Tibet. I think that's Tibet is not. And the Chechen, Charbalev, Nia, those among the Khotan is inside Tibet.
Okay, I think we'll go further than yeah. Most people, if I say I'm Tibetan, they say, what is that? And the worst question is, what is that? Not even where is that? What is that? That makes you really think. I hope you all don't get that question. If you say you're Uyghur, what is that? So that's why you do that, yeah? So that's why we have really a big job to do, actually, even to the international communities. I just wanted to put this so that we are aware of our roots and our, flags. In Tibetan, we call our flag Thaja, whereas you all call it, what do you call it in your language? Yeah? I don't want to pronounce because I'm sure I'm going to pronounce it wrong. So it looks so beautiful, and I hope we'll be able to raise these two flags someday, even if it has to take 100 years. Well, I just showed you this movie about Tashi Wangchuk. You all saw what it was about. I don't know if I have to go through the whole thing, He just wanted to do exactly what, according to the Chinese law, you know, our language is getting diminished, you know, and what he gets, he went to Beijing for two things, to get to the TV and to the TV and to file a lawsuit. He didn't get both of them. He ended up in the jail. According to the UNESCO, there are around 6,000 to 7,000 spoken languages in the world, and Tibetan is not one of them. They haven't even recorded it as neither independent language nor Chinese language. And as you all know, you know, when Omer Kamat, you spoke about all those issues, I was just thinking, this is exactly what I have written, you know, here, agenda of the PRC, what they want to do with our, you know, to make the Mandarin more, what you call, known to the whole world, I would say, actually. So that way, when they do that, they deny both political and socio-economic opportunities to the minorities, as we call ourselves minorities now. Salom, it was discussed earlier that minorities, I also feel that it is politically not correct to say minorities. And some even try to put us in indigenous people, and that I do not accept either. So, but the fact is that we are minorities under the Chinese rule. So as you all can see, the whole point of making Chinese language, the Mandarin, is to eradicate us. Simple as that. I don't need all these words. It's just to eradicate us, our culture, our language. And the consequences are exactly as you put it. It goes to the education, workforce, safety, tourism, everything. And that way, the Tibetans and Uyghurs become the second-rate citizens, and they do not have the same opportunities as the normal Chinese speaking Mandarin. And if you learn Mandarin, they do come a little bit forward, but they do not get the same opportunities as the others. And it says so well in the Chinese constitutions, all those are only in papers. You say China has failed to enact all these laws, which says in their constitution and international law, and they just ignore everything. And we just keep shut, the whole world keeps shut, and we just go along. And we just let us bully. And if we all, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, if we don't stand, as someone in the former panel said, then we will also disappear, just as the other minorities. And today's situation, the picture that we saw earlier, in itself summarizes the whole thing. These are the things that actually are the consequences. The last resort for Tibetan parents in Tibet to survive, to let our language survive, is to send their children to India through these high mountains. And these children they are like 6 to 7 years old. They send their children to India so that they can learn our language. And it's still happening right now. And they desperately, they have to, you can imagine as a parent how difficult it must be for a parent to send away their children just to learn the language somewhere else than in China, than in Tibet. And that's the last resort. And as we all know, both our languages, both our country's languages are under attack under this Article 5, right? So you all can just read. Everything is in the papers. Everything is there, but it's not into practice. And China pays lip service to protecting the Tibetan language, And the Chinese government seems intent on subverting and eventually eliminating the use of the Tibetan mother tongue. And it goes same for you all. So that's why when you were talking, I was thinking, this is exactly what it is. Actually, I don't even need to stand here and say, I just would say, that is exactly Tibet is. So, Mandarin as the lingua franca of Tibet, and also to the other minorities. So what are the consequences of this is that even the Tibetan parents, they have to think about the children, you know. What do we do? Okay, let them learn Chinese, because if you do not learn Chinese, Mandarin, then you will not succeed. And Chinese are being, I was going to say deported, but they are being actually placed over there with systematically thinking that this Chinese language is supposed to prevail in Tibet. According to the Free Tibet campaign, the Chinese authorities occupying Tibet and making life impossible for Tibetans who are not fluent in Mandarin by passing laws to minimize teaching of Tibetan in schools and by replacing Tibetan language with Chinese language in many spheres of public life. That's it, actually. You said everything what I wanted to say, you know. And Tashi Wangchuk who was in the movie, he mentioned that since 2009, but this movie was made in 2015, 16, he said it was 140, but now it has gone to 152 Tibetan youngsters who have self-immolated. They burn themselves. Who does that? That is only the last resort. When you feel that, okay, my language is not respected, my culture is not respected, what is the point? And the government doesn't listen to you. What do? You sacrifice yourself and that is asking for help from the world, and the world doesn't listen. They just keep their eyes shut and do their usual business with China. Just last week, there was one 32 years old man, a young man, he self-immolated, just last week. So this is what is going on. It's just going on. And Tibet has less journalists than North Korea, than you can imagine how that is. So we need to fight. Both you and I and all of us need to fight against this. If you don't, then our children will just be, that will be a very, just a memory. Once upon a time, there was a Tibetan. Once upon a time, there was a Uyghur. And that would be just a fairy tale. And if you don't stand up now, the time is running out for both you and us. So we need to work together to this giant force. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And it was reflected in the video as well, just the sheer desperation of Tibetan people, and it is very similar to the Uyghur situation as well. And in the self-immolations, there's even more of an insult from the government that's been labeling them terrorism now, which is just almost, it's laughable. But effectively, this is really the only alternative. So we'll have a bit more time to speak about this and how it relates to other issues as well, and what's been happening in the Norwegian context with Tibet. But I'd like to pass on to Hayan Ma from Frostburg University in the U.S. in Maryland to speak about Islam in China and the geopolitical situation between China and other countries as well. So please.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, World Uyghur Congress, for inviting me here to talk about Islam, Muslim, especially Uyghur in Turkestan. Actually, my presentation is trying to answer the question. Brother Tokti already discussed why Chinese implemented this brutal policy towards Uyghurs. And actually, if you look at Chinese policy towards Uyghurs and East Turkestan, all these policies are not really consistent. Some people actually, when you discuss with Chinese scholars, even with some American academics, people always try to identify, for example, 1950s. That was kind of golden age. Chinese even cited some examples, say, Kuban, Uncle Kuban tried to go to Beijing to meet Chairman Mao, basically tried to show his support for the Chinese communists. This case basically illuminates that Uyghurs, according to Chinese propaganda, really support Chinese communists. So at least you really have a so-called golden age in 1950. Then of course go back to 1970s after so-called open door policy. You also have kind of liberal policy. Then of course during Cultural Revolutions you have very harsh policies. So which means Chinese policies are not really consistent. Then the question is why? Sometimes you really have kind of liberal policy. Sometimes you really have all these brutal policies. A lot of scholars really look at domestic factors, actually. But Tokti just mentioned historical perspective to look at Chinese culture. Chinese culture, of course, as we know, well, actually every culture, if you will, you really have kind of ethnic cultural centralism. I've tried to, of course, portray China or Chinese at the center of civilization. So that's why you have all these so-called barbarians, you have all this, so-called Confucian or Scenic Circle, which basically include China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, or part of Vietnam. So other people outside this so-called civic circle were considered as barbarian. So that's a historical explanation. But also we found some contemporary explanation basically from local rulership. For example, if you look at Chinese frontier rulership from at least the Qing dynasty, all these local or frontier generals, they tend to maximize their power by exaggerating the borderland threat. Or if you trace back to Tang Dynasty, of course, the most famous case is, as we know, the so-called An-Lushan Rebellion. The guy who actually controlled a huge military in northwestern frontier, and he finally even occupied Xi'an, the capital city. Then back to Qing Dynasty, also have very powerful military general stationed in Yidi, tried to control the whole East Turkestan. Then go back to PRC period, we also see after 1949, you have very powerful military general in East Turkestan, and also the so-called construction and development corps tried to control the whole region. And all these generals, of course, they serve as governor, as party secretary, and also as a military commander. Unfortunately, if you look at all these local rulers or governors, especially I think go back to 1990s, you have very famous brutal guy Wang Lequan, and then of course recently you have another guy Chen Guoquan. Both guys are very famous for suppressing Uyghurs in Turkestan. Then some scholars basically said, okay, if you try to understand all this brutal policy, you have to look at the individual factor. Wang Lequan, he built a very powerful network in Xinjiang. That's what people even joke. If you look at all these, construction materials in Xinjiang, they say, oh, okay, this just brought from Shandong. So that kind of corruption you can, imagine you have in Xinjiang or West Turkestan. Then, of course, Chen Guoquan also very famous, not only in Henan, but especially in Tibet, to suppress all these people. Of course, when you suppress all these minorities, you basically get political benefit. So that's why people always said, well, if you try to suppress no matter Uyghurs or Tibetan, as a local governor in Tibet or Turkestan, then of course you hope basically try to get promoted, especially into Central Political Bureau. That's the purpose for all these frontier commanders, if you will, or governors. So that's another explanation. But also you have other explanations, for example, some other Chinese intellectuals who actually are very much sympathizing with the Uyghurs. And I talked to them and I said, do you have any explanations why Chinese try to suppress all this Chinese? Now what's the benefit? If you claim all this region as part of China, why you suppress all these people? And one approach to that question is actually, some people said, well, if you look at East Turkestan, the so-called Uyghur issue actually is not really a Uyghur issue, it's actually a kind of peasant issue. It's just like China, anywhere like Henan, Shandong, you have all this, rural areas. Of course, you have local corruptions, you have peasant, dissatisfaction, even protest. Then they said, of course, if you look at East Turkestan, there's nothing to do with terrorism. It's basically about peasant issues. So you can imagine they have more explanation. But here, people basically look at domestic factors. And today I really talk about actually external factors. I just try to look at different historical period and even context. For example, I try to understand why since 1990s in East Turkestan you have so-called anti-Israeli forces. Then after 2000, especially after 2001, why you have all this repressive policy in East Turkestan. And also recently we see increasing suppression of not only Uyghurs but also actually Hui, Kazakh, even Han Chinese. So I just try to understand all the phenomena from a external perspective. Now first I would like to say if you look at from 1980s, two national campaigns became very much widespread when the so-called strike hard, actually from 1983, basically after the so-called open door policy, communists really believe some so-called Western influence came into China. That's why you have so-called strike hard. But in Turkestan, this so-called strike hard actually became politicized. They're not really against criminal behavior criminals. They basically try to target Uyghur from a political perspective. So that's a development. You cannot really find any politicization of strike hard in Beijing or Shandong or other provinces. So that's the first development. And the second one actually is around 1989, China actually established so-called anti-porno, anti-illegal publication office. Now what does it mean? It means they want to eliminate Western influences, Western publications. In other provinces, I really believe they try to control this porno from Hong Kong, imported from Japan, Taiwan. But again, in East Turkestan, you will see they gradually politicized. They began to target Islamic literature. Then after 2001, I would call this the second stage. Now while we talk about first stage, first if you look at all these phenomena, basically why you have all this politicization. Now my explanation is basically because if you look at it from late 1980s, especially to 1989, you have collapse of Soviet. And that's why especially the formation of Central Asian republics really worried the Chinese communists. So that's why you have all this politicization of strike hard. You have this politicization of so-called anti-porno, anti-illegal publication, try to control Uyghur Muslims. Then from 2001, of course, as we know, suddenly after September 11, China announced you have hundreds or maybe over 100 so-called terrorist groups, especially the so-called ETRM. And I remember a lot of publications, especially Xinjiang government, they released all kinds of papers, basically say, look, we have hundreds or thousands of terrorist attacks in the past decades, which year, which way, So what does it mean? It means they try to manipulate this event in the US, especially when the United States basically try to divide the world. Either you stand with us or either you are our enemy. So that's what, on the one hand, you can imagine, China was forced to select. You have to be a friend of the United States, which means you support the US way Afghanistan. But at the same time, China actually used this opportunity to try to suppress the Uyghur. That's why, on the one hand, they cooperated with the United States in Afghanistan. On the other hand, they began to suppress the Uyghur in East Turkestan, basically to openly attack the Uyghur as terrorists. So that's why if you look at here, after September 11, you have U.S.-China cooperation, then you have so-called Chinese anti-terror war in its own territory, they call Xinjiang. So how can you imagine you have so-called anti-terror war in your own country? That's a development. And also from this time, we observed that actually the Xinjiang government became so-called anti-terror commander. So that's why if you look at all this policy, after September 11, I would say Xinjiang actually replaced Beijing to make all this policy, try to lead all this policy, try to influence all Chinese policy. So that's why if you look at after September 11, Xinjiang actually became highest authority in so-called anti-terror war. Then this anti-terror war, as we know, in 2001, not only you have U.S. terrorist attack, but also you have Chinese cooperation with Central Asian countries, the formation of SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So that's what they try to extend so-called anti-terror war in East Turkestan all the way to whole Central Asia. So that's why you have all these organizations, so-called Uzbekistan Islamic Movement, Chechnya Movement, Now, of course, you already added the ETRM. So all this typical so-called terrorist group now begin to be justified as terrorist group. Every country try to fight. So here, both U.S. and such Asian countries, they basically try to manipulate September 11. And of course, China did very cleverly, just to try to suppress the Uyghur. And of course, if you look at all these propagandas, especially from 2001 to 2009, actually there was a huge development, especially in 2009. If you really pay attention to Chinese publications, in 2009, in Xinjiang, the local government actually formed a so-called Xinjiang Anti-Porno, Anti-Illegal Publication Office, which I said is already established in 1989. But by this time, they totally changed their rhetoric. If you read a Chinese article, Chinese newspaper, everything Chinese, they will say this is called 扫黄打非, anti-porno, anti-illegal. But if you look at China Daily, if you look at all this English propaganda, they said this is anti-terror literature, this is anti-terror publication. So that's why we say after 2009 in Pakistan, you actually have all this systematic confiscation or even elimination of Islamic literature, from Quran then to other texts which they actually labeled as a terrorist or terror literature. So here actually I remember one day when I read all this article in Chinese, then my wife said, "What are you reading?" I said, Xinjiang government, they said they will have a so-called anti-porno, anti-illegal office. They were going to govern all 5 northwestern provinces, which included my hometown, Qinghai province, which is the Amdo of Tibet. Then my wife said, "No, you're not telling the truth." I said, "Yes." She said, "I read China Daily, and they said they are anti-terror literature." Then we actually compared the two, Chinese version and the English version. They actually use 2 sets of rhetorics. To the international community, they said this is the anti-terror literature or anti-terror publication. Then in Chinese, they say this is the anti-porno, anti-illegal. So that's why from 2009 to today, if you look at the whole Northwest, not only Turkestan, but almost today to Gansu, Qinghai, Islamic literatures began to be controlled, began to be confiscated, even began to be eliminated. So that's a development. The other phenomenon, or the other phrase I noticed is actually around 2014, because from 2014, we see not only in Turkestan, but actually in Gansu, Qinghai, you have all this so-called Hellenization. You will see on Chinese Weibo social media, you have systematic attack on Islam. I'm Muslim. I cannot show some pictures here, but actually if you guys, visit Chinese Weibo social media, you will see a lot of pictures, demonize Islam, demonize Prophet, demonize all this, Mecca. It's really a huge insult on Muslim and Islam. And government actually quietly allow them to do that. So that's why I said after 2009, you will see all this, illegalization of Islamic literature. After 2014, you will see increased suppression of Islamic literature. Then my question is, why you suppress all these books, no matter, translated into Uyghur, translated into Chinese, for example, Quran? My explanation is actually, if you look at from 2014 to 2016, one development actually is, again, one more time, not in East Turkestan, but actually in East Turkestan neighborhood, Afghanistan. But this time, not anti-terror war in Afghanistan, but actually the appearance of Islamic State in Holoshan province. Again, that's a very important development. From 2014, I said why Chinese actually suppress not only Islamic literature in East Turkestan, but also in Gansu, Qinghai, even in all these non-Uyghur regions, simply because they began to target Islam. So that's why today we see from 2014 to 2016, actually I would say not only in Turkestan, not only Uyghurs, but probably you guys already know even Kazakhs, Tongans, Salas, they were arrested, sentenced, and actually I know personally some Han some teachers actually at the school, they were arrested and now put into the so-called re-education center. And of course, we also know overseas students, not only Uyghurs, but actually Tongan, Savas, they were arrested from all these Middle Eastern countries and deported to China. And I personally know some people already in jail. And also we know some Tongan fans in Kashgar, they were sentenced simply because they put some Uyghur literature in their hotels, everything. So that kind of development. So my conclusion is, if you try to understand all this situation, repressive policy in Turkestan, two aspects. One is, of course, all these domestic reasons I will not talk about, since we have so many scholars working on that. I basically talk about all these external factors. The first one is the Soviet. The collapse of Soviet really, I would say, push the Chinese to implement a very repressive policy, try to control the so-called Uyghuristan, because they worry about if you have such Asian republics, you may have a Uyghuristan. And the second factor, of course, is the Afghan war. Here, of course, I have to say United States, of course, made a huge mistake by recognizing so-called terrorist group. And of course, later on, if you look at State Department, they just deleted, then they added. So that's why here, the so-called terrorist group actually is kind of business between US and China. The third factor, of course, from 2014 is the Islamic State in Kurdistan province. And I suspect this phenomenon probably will affect Turkestan Uyghurs, but also Tongans and other Muslims. So that's why today actually I already heard some news that some Tongans were already arrested. And one case basically said one possibly Tongan Sala joined with IS. So we suspect this is probably a government, created phenomenon because they need justification, just like the Soviet, they need justification to prevent so-called separatism. Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, then they need an excuse to prevent so-called extremism. Now they need to prevent so-called terrorism, which means if you look at, or if you link KP to Muslim in China, no matter in Turkestan or these northwestern provinces, then you want to, in the future, you basically have anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim movement in China. So all these external factors can help us better understand why all these irrational policies implemented, not only in East Turkestan, but now extended to northwestern provinces. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great from connecting into the first panel and the question I had that I mentioned that I asked. So what is the reason for this, for this policy? And I think you answered, at least in part, some of the reasons why. And one of the interesting things that you spoke about too is just such a clear example of the way that the government presents the policies to the international community on the one hand. So when you see Xinhua or China Daily put out things in English, essentially connecting it to terrorism and counterterrorism, because if you use this language, this narrative, people of course drop into a certain framework of, okay, well it's terrorism, so counterterrorism, these policies must be the appropriate response. And then of course the Chinese domestic audience, you see it anti-ideology, nothing about the state, and you see it being sort of this narrative being constructed within China in that respect. And then we'll come back to sort of some of the issues with China's relationship with perhaps the US and what's been happening in Europe. And it's a good transition to our third speaker, who's Ryan Barry from the World Uyghur Congress, who will also speak sort of generally about what the Uyghur Congress has been doing in Europe especially, and to a certain extent maybe North America, but mostly Europe, and some of the challenges that we faced especially. And as some other speakers have already mentioned, we've seen China sort of reaching across outside of China and really intimidating people and countries and organizations. So if Ryan could give us a bit on that.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I'll try to be quick so we have some time for discussion after. But good afternoon, everybody. I'd first like to thank all the previous speakers. It was very beneficial to hear their perspectives and insights. As has been made clear from several of the previous speeches, the problems the Uyghur community faces are urgent and potentially existential. As Mr. Issa mentioned in his opening remarks, the situation looks daunting, but we must have hope. So we must ask ourselves, what exactly should we do to ensure that the linguistic and cultural rights of the Uyghur people are protected? What can be done to make the international community finally overcome its apathy and be spurred into action? What small actions can each person take to make some sort of impact? All of us, Uyghurs or not, should ask ourselves these questions as we conclude this conference. For those of you who will attend the Human Rights Training Seminar in the following days, we would like you to keep this in mind as well. So the World Uyghur Congress has been doing its utmost to raise these issues in the European Union, the United Nations, and with national governments with some success. We've been active in the Human Rights Council, raising specific cases with UN special procedures, and meeting with state missions to inform them about the situation in East Turkestan and to push them to hold China accountable, especially at China's upcoming Universal Periodic Review this fall. In the European Union, we've been active in collaboration with our partners from the Unrepresented Nations Peoples Organization, meeting with members of the European Parliament, the European External Action Service, and the European Commission. This fall, after some great work from the Unrepresented Nations Peoples Organization, a Uyghur Friendship Group was created in the European Parliament, which will streamline our activities and allow us to react to urgent situations more quickly. Uyghur organizations like the Norway Uyghur Committee, human rights organizations, and civil society have all been equally tireless in their advocacy efforts, yet we still see the Chinese government double down on suppression of Uyghurs, restricting religious freedom, arbitrarily detaining thousands of innocent people, and attempting to erode Uyghur language and culture. While we endeavor to pursue all possibilities to improve the situation and feel that our efforts in some areas are making progress, there is still much more we can and must do. If we are to stand up to China, there's an urgent need for unity, as the previous speaker said, between marginalized communities and oppressed people, the Uyghurs, Tibetans, so the Mongolians, between civil society, human rights NGOs, and states who believe in the value of human rights and democracy. We must focus on the current situation and recognize that regardless of your perspective or interest, what is happening to the Uyghur people in China is objectively and morally wrong. There is a need for coordination and solidarity between the actions of different organizations and between the national, regional, and international levels. This event today is a good example of how different segments of society can rally in support of basic rights. The strategy of the Chinese government has been to divide and conquer sympathetic states or organizations. This has been very apparent. Just last year, using economic incentives and the promise of investment, the Chinese government successfully influenced Greece to block an EU joint statement on human rights and the Human Rights Council. Judging from the remarks of the previous speakers, Norway is also experiencing similar pressure from the Chinese government. Furthermore, although the repression of the Uyghur people should be reason alone for individuals and states to speak out and take action, China's attack on human rights poses a danger to everyone and threatens to undermine the very concept of human rights. Coming from a human rights background, I'm very concerned about especially what we've seen in the UN, in the EU, and within states. During the most recent UN Human Rights Council session, the Chinese mission put forward a resolution which the previous Amnesty speaker spoke about, attempting to take apart the human rights system from within, labeling it as promoting the international human rights cause through a win-win cooperation. The resolution seeks to reconstitute human rights as a matter of state sovereignty that should largely be dealt with internally by the offending states themselves. It seeks to portray human rights as culturally relative and subservient to the needs of a country to develop economically. The fact that the Chinese government is preventing the UN Security Council, as we speak, from taking actions against acts of ethnic cleansing and possible genocide in Myanmar against the Rohingya people, for example, and have stated that other states must respect Myanmar's sovereignty, speaks volumes about how human rights would look like if the Chinese government gets its way. States do not have the right to do as they please with the people under their control, and to claim that they should not be criticized due to state sovereignty. Implicit in the concept of sovereignty is the responsibility to protect their own citizens, their basic rights, and their well-being. The Chinese government clearly is not doing this with the Uyghur people, the Tibetans, the Southern Mongolians, and even the Han Chinese citizens. China's approach to human rights, focused on economic development and respect for state sovereignty, transfers the rights from individuals to the state, effectively stripping people of their humanity and portraying them as merely in service of the state itself. Therefore, the repression of Uyghur people is not an isolated case, not something that can be dismissed or taken lightly. The fate of the Uyghur people is intertwined with all people and with our current international order. No one Uyghur or human rights organization has the resources or manpower to hold the Chinese government accountable and to counter the growing influence alone. As one academic told me, China is like a giant blob. You expend massive amounts of energy just trying to keep it in place, but as soon as you take a step back, it quickly fills that space. We've seen this already, especially with regards to the US, as they've taken a step back in the international order, and we've seen China quickly rush to fill the space. Therefore, if we are to help the Uyghur people, we all have to redouble our efforts. What is happening now to the Uyghur and Tibetans should serve as a wake-up call for the international community. We are therefore reaching a critical point, not just for the Uyghur people, but for all the world's citizens. We are arriving at a crossroads in human history that will determine the course our future will take. I hope that we all play a small part in determining that future. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan, for that. Yeah, I think that brings up a number of issues. From the perspective of the World Uyghur Congress, we're sort of on the front line of advocacy efforts, and we see firsthand in places like Geneva, Brussels, and even in Munich, what China's been doing. So just small examples. For example, we may have a side event, or there's some kind of statement being made that attaches importance to the Uyghur issue. Tibetans experience this as well, I know, in Geneva and elsewhere, and China's there. Every single event we do, the Chinese delegation is there. They sort of wait patiently in the back, and then afterwards they'll raise their hand and they'll make their statement. It's never a question. It's always a 2 or 3 minute statement about actually what you're saying is completely wrong and there's no evidence. And they ask, "Have you been to China lately?" And we say, "Well, we're not allowed to go because," and it's just so interesting. But also as well, if you look at the Chinese delegations at the UN, for example, it's always read from a script. There's sort of canned lines, and the narrative, again, like as I mentioned before, is very important. They've been using certain phrases, this win-win cooperation, and sort of emphasizing, of course, territorial integrity, and they keep using phrases like judicial sovereignty, sovereignty in terms of social media and the internet, which are just mostly fabricated. They sort of come out of thin air, and then they use them over and over. And every single statement that's made in these international institutions and fora, they repeat the same things over and over. And it's very purposeful. It's to construct a narrative that is very much counter to, for the most part, Western belief in human rights and the universality of human rights and the ability of people just to effectively, for example, to speak their own language, like we're speaking about today. So from that, I suppose I can transition into, so Tashi Wangchuk's case has been brought up at the UN in Geneva, but again, as I mentioned, you get the same response from China. They effectively say that, I'm not sure exactly what was the actual, so he's been charged with subversion of state power, yes? And I think he's awaiting the verdict now, but as mentioned in the video, the percentage rate of people being convicted is 99%, so effectively he most likely will be convicted for, as I mentioned in the first panel, just trying to sort of play by the rules, trying to use the actual legal system that's in place in China to press his case. And I mentioned briefly also Ilham Tohti, who was in prison in January 2014, and then he was in prison for life after a 2-day trial. I think his charge was advocating for separatism. Ilham Tohti never once made any kind of statement that had to do with separatism. There was never anything publicly made apparent about that. Of course, they sentenced him. And it comes back to, I think, using people as symbols. So Tashi Wangchuk and Ilham Tohti and all these people, of course, the charges are completely unwarranted, but they know that the international community is watching. So I think what I wanted to ask is, I came across, there's a quote by Deng Xiaoping back when he was in power, and he said of China's approach should be to hide your strength and bide your time. So sort of pull back and just wait for your moment. So I think the question that I might want to ask is this the moment that they've been waiting for a long time? Are they able to move into the space that other states have been withdrawing from? We've seen it with Norway in some respects, but of course the US after the Trump election, we've seen China sort of move into that space. As Ryan mentioned, they're this sort of blob that sort of takes control of the space that we revoke. So I wonder if maybe you could comment, maybe in the US context and maybe what you've seen perhaps in Norway in terms of that. Is China really moving into that space now, the past year? Is this the reason for some of the actions that have taken place recently?
As far as I can say is that when we speak to the Norwegian politicians, and that's very rare nowadays because they don't dare to stand beside me, at least with these clothes on. They say that what China does when they have these meetings is that they present the human rights issues, you know, so that it is easier for the other part not to talk about it, because they have already talked about it now. We just go, you know, that is how they take their space. That is how they dominate. That is how they kind of show their willingness to work towards human rights, just to one of the agendas in their papers, you know, so that other people can say, oh, they have taken it up, you know, now we are finished with it. Let's go to the next issue about business. That is their strategy, I think.
Because I think to sort of build on top of that is that China has not been, they have been very much present at the Human Rights Council, for example, but they've been present, as I said, building this narrative that is counter to sort of the human rights narrative. I don't know if perhaps you can speak about the situation in terms of the U.S.
Well, I would say the Chinese assertion, if you will, or aggression can be felt almost everywhere, every area. Well, at the international level, we know in South China Sea, you know, territory dispute with India, Central Asia, almost everywhere. But even personally, it's really interesting. I think last year, 2 years ago, some Chinese scholars even identified scholars in the U.S., including my advisors, me. They say, okay, we have some kind of so-called open dialogue with you guys regarding, you know, Xinjiang issue. Then we met with some professors, including my advisor, James Millward, Sharon Roberts, and one professor from GW University, Tibetan scholar. And we talk about this issue. They say, okay, you know, you guys have some misunderstanding, you know, not really about terrible situation in Xinjiang, but probably you guys should visit Xinjiang. Then we just say, okay, we will visit, but what's the problem? They say, okay, if you guys, you know, friendly to China, everything will be okay, you know, that kind of, even personally. So, and also I can feel, if you look at recently, another explanation why, if you look at Uzbekistan, Tibet, even to some extent in Mongolia, you have all this situation deteriorated. One explanation probably is the so-called the Chinese Renaissance or Chinese revival. Especially if you look at Chinese populism, which is really scary, especially on the social network, especially Chinese Weibo social media. You have very powerful so-called Chinese Huanghan movement. I literally translated Royal Han, Noble Han. They basically attack every non-Han people. You barbarian Uyghurs, you dirty Tibetans, you violent Muslims, and you Mongols. And literally they would say, wish to kill all them. And even especially Muslim Islam. So that's why I said 2 weeks ago, maybe 1 week, I cannot really remember, the Chinese Religious Bureau, the guy actually, he was asked by Hong-Kongese journalists, you know, nowadays you have all the social media attack Islam, Muslim, what's your response, what's your opinion? And he said, this is not right, I will not agree with what they are doing on the internet. Now you can imagine if a Chinese religious official openly said, I will not agree with what they did, or what we have done. So can you imagine what's the signal he tried to send to all this so-called noble Han or royal Han? The message is so clear, which means this is a popular movement. I will not agree, but I cannot condemn or I cannot prevent. So that's what we said. This is really scary. Well, in the U.S., you do have very populist, you know, president, but in China, you have very populist, you know, Han group. So that's what we said. Not only Uyghurs, almost every ethnic minority nowadays really feels threatened.
Yeah, and I think especially in terms of what's happening, as I mentioned in the first panel, that there's a Penn report that came out that's very, very good, and it talks about how the Chinese social media environment is actually very dynamic, and there's a lot of things happening. And it's interesting that the gentleman would say something that we have no real control, but there's tremendous control.
That's the lie. That's basically really
Right.
That's more Nazi than Nazis. If you look at Chinese social media material,
Yeah.
that's totally Nazi.
Right. I mean,
Yeah. They will say we kill everyone. We kill Uyghurs, we kill Muslims, we kill Mongols.
right, and we can all probably imagine what would happen if this kind of stuff was posted.
If a Muslim say something, you know, actually, one of the case I know personally, one of the Tongkai in Kashgar, he reposted it to Twitter. It's not really Twitter, it's the social media and the Chinese Weibo.
Yeah.
And the two Weibo, one is, he basically, you know, forwards it, okay, everyone should wear what he or she likes. He just forward. The other one is, He said, I just think, all these people impose threat to the state. Then Kashgar government arrested him, and I remember he was sentenced for 7 years in jail, and also simply because he ran a hotel actually to demonstrate all this with the corruption. That's the only reason why local government tried to prosecute him, not because, that's the excuse is, okay, you retweet this to post.
Right, I think we see that in terms of technology as a double-edged sword, of course, technology and
They can try every detail.
Right, exactly. But so the idea of social media and sort of more connectedness, interconnectedness between people, that sounds great, but on the other hand, the government has been using the technology itself to...
But they allow the Han, extremists to attack all non-Han people.
I think you're right. I think that aligns with sort of the narrative of what's been happening in recent years as well. And then perhaps, Ryan, maybe if you can speak briefly about sort of the perspective from the EU. You're based in Brussels, and maybe you see a bit more of this. Can you sort of comment on what you've seen in terms of China's approach to the EU in recent years?
As I said in the speech, you certainly see an approach to try to divide and conquer. So the EU, when it speaks with one voice, is a very powerful one, and it's been supportive of the Uyghurs in the past. It's a very important voice that if we're going to succeed at all, we have to continue to have. But using the Belt and Road, using promises of economic incentives and important investment, they are succeeding to some extent to divide it, as was the case with Greece. Now they're targeting a lot of countries in Central Asia and the Balkans with 16+1 initiative. As I know, they still accept the Dalai Lama to come to these countries, which is kind of the litmus test for whether they're fully influenced by China or not. So far it's okay, but we see this effort really very strongly. I can just say from my activities in Europe, you see the Chinese influence more and more. There's a particular think tank. I've gone to 2 of their sessions. Both of them are just putting forward the Chinese agenda. For example, there was one on the Belt and Road Initiative. They had 4 Han Chinese people, one Uyghur person who was aligned with the government. They did not talk about the Belt and Road Initiative at all. The entire time, they talked about how everything in East Turkestan was fine, how the Uyghurs were happy, how everything was great. And I just asked one question about religious freedom, since they claim they have it, and I said, well, we have reports that they clearly don't. And I was shouted at. And I went again, and it was the same thing. So it's a strong propaganda think tank that's being put forward as an academic exercise. And the dangerous thing is that it's being attended by powerful people. The US Embassy went there, people from the European Commission are attending, and I think they take it with a grain of salt, but they're also taking in the Chinese narrative. I just had a colleague who also went to the European Parliament, and she said everywhere there was free China dailies. Everywhere. So we can really see they're making an effort to influence European opinion. And we have to make sure that we redouble our efforts to counter this narrative. Otherwise, they have a lot more resources and they're very active, and if we do nothing, then they'll win.
Right. Sure.
Just thinking about this newly passed law about the religious regulations religious affairs. They are doing this because of the fact that also related to Tibet is like they're waiting for Dalai Lama to die, right? And that is when they're going to attack.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that Dalai Lama says that I will not be reborn in a country which is like, closed, will be born in a free country. But at the same time, they're using, they're saying that they will choose the next Dalai Lama. They're not saying completely, but they are saying it. A communist country, a communist regime is going to choose the next reincarnation. It doesn't balance, right? Communism. Then in that case, like Dalai Lama says, then first they should find Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping first, the reincarnation of these two first, and then they can talk about Dalai Lama. So these are the things they are, using very tactically. So they want to rule completely the minds of Tibetans, but they can't, because if you rule out Dalai Lama, you can't get the sympathy from the Tibetans. After 60 years, there are still youngsters born under the Chinese, 60, there are 6 generations, right? Still, they are self-immolating. They are running away from China. Why, So, that is what I wanted to say about the strategic...
Sure, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I just remember one case when Ryan talked about the Chinese penetration. So I think actually last week when Mr. Quincy, was visiting Washington, D.C., and I know he visited USIP, probably you guys know United States Institute of Peace. But this institute, I think 6 months ago, they published a piece. They actually asked one guy from George Washington University, a so-called lawyer, a lady actually. She composed a piece and she said, oh, Uyghurs are terrorists. Now I think IFA, their president actually sent a letter protest against the USIP. Remember, USIP is funded by US Congress. I don't know if Mr. Omar can anyone know that?
Yes.
So that's why when they talk about this issue, I actually told my wife, USIP should be sued by IFA or Uyghur organization because this is not a minor mistake. USIP represents US Congress. USIP represents US Congress policy formation, but you guys began to call Uyghurs as terrorists. So that's really a serious mistake. And then because of course they have no control actually the director. She found this so-called scholar from George Washington and wrote that piece. And of course Uyghur service, IFA, I think they report to the President Mr. Liu, I forgot the president's name. Yeah, they sent a protest letter to the USIP, and actually I read that letter. It's very strong. Basically, you guys not only ignorant, but you guys purposely try to demonize the Uyghur people. But that issue actually ended without any result. I would say if our Uyghur organization or IFA actually it's a really good case to sue USIP because that's the federal government funded organization, even penetrated by all this mentality.
Yeah, thanks. I hate to end on such a depressing note. I find we speak at these events and things, and it just seems like a hopeless situation. And Tashi Ronchuk's case is just the embodiment of that. When you just can't. I mean, you want to work within the system. There's no way to work outside of the system. So I'd like to thank. I mean, we can continue this conversation. This will be. We'll have a workshop over the next 2 days with Uyghurs and Uyghur youth in Norway. I'm talking about this. So I wanted to thank the panelists for this panel. From the Norwegian Tibet Committee, Ayan Ma coming from the US and Ryan from the Uyghur Congress, as well as the speakers, Rafto Amnesty and Omar Kanat from the UHRP in the US. I think at the very least we're trying to diagnose the problem and then we can sort of take steps in terms of how to fix it. I think the workshop that will happen in the next 2 days will be sort of our attempt to answer some of those questions. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'm sorry it couldn't be too much more hopeful. I think it's important to have some kind of hope in these situations, but I think, as I said, it's important to understand exactly what's happening so that we can take steps to improve. So thank you all for coming, and I hope it's been informative, and we can continue talking afterwards. So thank you. Yeah, otherwise.
I think every year.
Yeah, I think that's
Do you have a card? Because I don't have any printed copies. I have to throw out my laptop. Okay, I'll send that to you a little later. Nice to meet you.
In the middle.
So still.